Hello, everyone. My name is Malayna Rowe. I am a senior exercise science student from Shippensburg University, and I'm a member of the Wood Honors College. My presentation today is on NSAID usage patterns and the possible negative side effects in Shippensburg University student athletes. I wanted to say thank you to my peers, Randy Smith, Mike Lingard, and Alexi Castro for helping me with this research, and also a huge thank you to Dr. Samuel Forlenza, my advisor. You might be wondering why I chose this topic, and that's because I actually work with Shippensburg Sports Medicine, and I talked to each of the trainers and asked them what were some of the topics that they wanted to gain information on so that they could help our student athletes improve performance, health, those kinds of things. And one of the topics that one of the trainers provided was how often are students taking NSAIDs such as ibuprofen. So I took that topic and ran with it, and here we are. Let me zoom in here for you guys so you can see a little bit better. So we'll start off here with a little background. NSAIDs are a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, and they're one of the most common used because they are an over-the-counter medication. And there's growing concern on NSAID usage because athletes are consuming them, it seems, more often, and why they're consuming them is changing because while they can have many beneficial effects, there also can be many negative effects. So athletes could take them to relieve pain, lessen swelling, help with inflammation. They can also be taken for fevers, but there's a little bit of worry that comes with that because of the negative side effects that NSAIDs have, such as causing GI distress, heart problems, liver problems, those kinds of things if they're taken in not the proper ways. So the purpose of this study was to collect data on NSAID usage, the perceptions and current knowledge among the Shippensburg athletes at the Division II level. And then this data can hopefully then be used by medical professionals, trainers, coaches to help further educate students in this population. My group hypothesized that an athlete's use of NSAIDs would correlate positively with the increase in their academic year. So as they get older, more banged up, maybe they have more injuries, they'd be taking more NSAIDs. And then we further hypothesized that athletes chose to take NSAIDs in anticipation of pain or experiencing injury rather than taking them because they already had pain. Lastly, one of our main hypotheses was that many athletes are not fully aware of the big potential negative side effects that improper NSAID use could cause. So then for the methods of this research, we had 70 participants from Shippensburg University intercollegiate athletes. 52 reported as female and 14 reported as male. Everyone was between the age of 18 and 22. We used questionnaires to maintain social distancing and be safe during the pandemic. So participants were asked to fill out demographic information first regarding age, gender, school year, stuff like that. And then follow-up questions in the questionnaire were used to gather information about their NSAID consumption patterns and current knowledge. So for the procedure, we actually used the Associate Athletic Director at Shippensburg to forward an email out to all student athletes. And this email included a link to Qualtrics survey software, which had our survey questions. So before starting any questions, of course, though, we had an informed consent document and made sure that students realized they were confirming voluntary participation, and then they went on to complete the questions regarding NSAIDs. And we had a whole bunch of questions that ranged anything from, do you use NSAIDs before or after games, before or after practices? How do you get NSAIDs? Do you buy them yourselves? Do you get them from coaches? Do you get them from teammates? Do you get them from the trainer? How many are you taking in a dose? How many are you taking in a day? All sorts of different questions. So we would have a lot of data. And then for our data analysis, we chose to run Spearman's Rowe correlations using SPSS software to see if there were any significant correlations between the demographic questions and the NSAID survey questions. And then frequency analysis were also conducted to find some of the most pertinent reasons for NSAID consumption, how many participants use NSAIDs properly and are taking the recommended dosage, and whether majority of student athletes are actually aware of the potential side effects. So for our results, the first Spearman's Rowe correlation that we ran determined that there was actually not a significant correlation in class year to more NSAID consumption. And then a second Spearman's Rowe correlation that we ran was to identify association in weight to NSAID usage, because we kind of thought maybe some of our larger athletes, such as football linemen, might take more NSAIDs because they're bigger, they're getting beat up more out on the field. And we found significant correlations in the highest number of pills taken in a dose and the maximum taken in one day. And you can actually see these down here in table 1, our significant values here in correlation to weight, have the asterisks by them. And then we ran a whole bunch of frequency analyses. We found a whole bunch of things, just to name a few. 31 roughly % of athletes somewhat agreed to taking NSAIDs just because they were anticipating pain, and about 7% strongly agreed with this. So you have roughly 40% of athletes just taking these pills because they're anticipating experiencing pain, but they're not actually currently in pain. And then we had about 48.6% of the athletes did not believe that NSAIDs could negatively impact how they would heal, and 21% were not sure if it would impact them. Furthermore, about 12.9% of the athletes did not think NSAIDs could cause tumor growth, and 47.1% were not sure of that. So we have a lot of students obviously not aware of the negative impacts. Further on, we noticed that 30% of the participants took more than the recommended dose on the NSAID labels. So while you might think that 30% doesn't seem like a lot, when you put it in a pie chart, it actually is a pretty big chunk of the population to be taking too many NSAIDs. And then, like I said, we ran a whole lot of frequency analyses, so we had a whole bunch more of data. We had numbers regarding what was the longest consecutive number of days you took NSAIDs for, and the average number for that was 6.36% or 6.36 days. And then, but we also had students that said they had taken them for 30 days, or one had taken them for over a month. So while we did have some outliers, those outliers are pretty concerning. And then as a follow-up question to that, we asked, how many consecutive days do you believe it's safe to take NSAIDs for? And answers ranged anywhere from a couple days to a week to several students said 2 weeks, several students said every day. So that was really alarming. And then we actually found that about 60.5% of the athletes surveyed strongly or somewhat agreed that if they were in pain, they would use NSAIDs just so that they could compete and get through their game or practice. So all kinds of great results, interesting results. On to the discussion. So based on our results, we failed to accept our first hypothesis that the NSAID consumption would increase as academic year increased. There was a slight positive correlation, but it wasn't significant enough. Our results did support our second hypothesis that athletes self-medicate with NSAIDs like ibuprofen in anticipation of injury rather than taking it to alleviate current pain. And around 40% of the athletes admitted to that. So this falls in line with other studies that got about the same percentage of athletes using NSAIDs just because they're so afraid of getting hurt or experiencing pain that they don't want to miss out on a game or practice, because playing time is the #1 thing you want in a college sport, and the thought of that getting taken away from them is amazing that they would take NSAIDs just to prevent that. And as you can see here, that was also found in another study that about 30% of athletes would use the NSAIDs just to avoid missing a practice or game. Next, we found that the 48% of athletes that responded to NSAIDs don't negatively affect the healing process, which they actually do affect the healing process. So this was really alarming. Don't get me wrong, NSAIDs can be effective in treating short-term pain, like I said earlier, helping with swelling, fevers, but chronic and long-term and improper use can start to be detrimental. And athletes who seem to want to mask their pain with NSAIDs might not be aware of the long-term consequences. And so that data that we collected and those results supported our third hypothesis that most athletes aren't aware of the potential negative effects, such as the tumor growth affecting the healing process, causing GI distress, all sorts of not good things. So that is why we're hoping this study could be used moving forward to educate athletes on how to safely use NSAIDs, when they should take them and when they should not. And then of course, what the negative side effects are and how they can really impact a student athlete if they're, competing for 4 years and not practicing safe behaviors for 4 years. So we did have several limitations in this study. First and foremost, again, we'd use a survey because of the pandemic. And with the survey, you do have selection bias, and we definitely saw that because we had a lot of student athletes from like women's track, women's field hockey, way more than we had from like football, or we didn't have many baseball participants. And then we also had the limitation of self-reported data. So students might have chose answers based on their comprehension of the question and what they thought would be a socially acceptable answer, and they might not have been 100% honest in their answers. So for future research, we recommend using more specific questions aimed at the NSAID education status to find out even more about what athletes do and don't know about NSAIDs. And then we also thought it'd be interesting to compare NSAID usage frequencies in season compared to out of season athletes, because I think it would be used more in season. I know I have teammates, I'm on the track team, and I have teammates that I see taking ibuprofen pills every day before practice. That's kind of concerning. In the future, we also recommended targeting specific populations and sports teams for more responses. So such as like football, in the future, we would recommend maybe talking with the football coach and having him, remind his athletes about the survey so that way we could have more athletes from that sport participate. And then that would also increase our number of male participants. And then lastly for that, we also recommended maybe expanding this research to a more diverse population, expand it to all the NCAA athletes. And then maybe this would even allow for comparison among D1, D2, D3 to see if there's any difference, since D1 might be more vigorous than a D3 school with more practices throughout the day, that kind of stuff. Lastly, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge that we would like to thank Miss Ashley Grimm, the Associate Athletic Director from our athletic department, for helping us distribute this survey and allowing our research to be possible. And I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me at mr9941@ship.edu. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.